Because heavenly bodies contain ether in varying degrees of purity, and because anything composed of ether is eternal, Aristotle concludes that the heavenly bodies always have and always will continue in their circular paths around the earth. This is known as a geocentric or earth-centered view of the universe. It can be contrasted with today's heliocentric or sun-centered understanding of the way the planets move. Aristotle believes that his view of the universe helps us to be certain that nature will provide the right conditions to sustain the species. For though the sun travels eternally around the earth, its path is elliptical. This path sometimes brings the sun closer, and other times farther away from the earth. This changing distance between sun and earth brings on the seasons of warmth and coolness. Living things tend to procreate when it's warm, and to die when it's cold.
Thus we see that generation occurs as the sun comes close, and decay occurs as it retreats from the earth. Generation and passing away will always be continuous and will never fail because of the cause we have mentioned.
To Aristotle, the eternal circular motion of the sun in the heavens can help explain the cycle of existence. In this cycle, living things develop into their respective essences, propagate themselves, and eventually pass out of existence. But what causes the eternal motion of the sun? Aristotle's answer, as we might expect, is that the sun moves in an orbit. The sun's orbit is linked to other orbits in which the planets move. So, as the planets move, the sun moves. The planetary orbits are in turn linked to the orbits of fixed stars at the very edge of the universe. As Aristotle conceived the universe, then, the stars move in the outermost heavens, and this moves the other orbits of the other heavenly bodies in a perfectly mechanical way, much like a system of gears. The earth, at the center of the universe, does not move at all. Aristotle uses the term sphere to refer to the orbits of the heavenly bodies.
It is on account of this that other motions move one body, because the motions before the last one move many bodies, and the last sphere moves many spheres. The work of the last one, therefore, will belong to the others.
Still, some principle has to explain the motion of the outermost orbit of the fixed stars. Aristotle recognizes he must explain why motion takes place eternally in the universe. To find his answer, we need to return to his work, The Metaphysics.
There is something which is eternally moved with an unceasing motion, and this is a circular motion. This is clear not only in theory, but in fact. Thus, the ultimate sphere of the heavens must be eternal. Therefore, there is something which moves it. Since what is in motion and moves something else cannot be an ultimate mover, there is something which moves and which is not itself in motion. Something both a substance and an actuality.
Aristotle says that the eternal circular movement of the heavens ultimately can be explained only if there is an ultimate mover, something that is not itself moved by anything else. But how can something move the stars without in any way being in motion itself? To see how this can be, we must piece together Aristotle's explanation from various writings. First, in the lecture called On the Heavens, Aristotle tells us that we must assume that the stars are alive and have souls. This notion was by no means foreign to the Greeks of antiquity.
We might think that the stars are mere bodies or units, moving in an orderly way, and yet do not have souls. But we ought to think that they have souls and act.
Second, the souls of the stars are not animal souls, so the stars have no animal desires. Rather, they have intellect, and desires that are directed solely by their intellect. In the Metaphysics, Aristotle explains that an unmoved mover can cause the stars to move simply by being thought about and desired, by being an object that is loved.
But an object of thought and an object of desire produce motion without being moved. For the real good is the object of the intellect. The object for the sake of which a motion occurs can be unchanging. It produces motion by being loved.
In his work, The Physics, Aristotle explains that the stars ultimately are moved by a fourth cause. Here, the purpose, the goal of a movement, explains why it took place. The stars move in order to be, as much as possible, like something they understand to be good. Since the stars must move eternally, the goodness they seek also must be eternal. Aristotle sometimes calls this eternal and immutable goodness the unmoved mover, or the prime mover. The stars imitate its perfection in the only way they can, through eternal motion in perfect circles around the heavens. We shouldn't be surprised that Aristotle calls this perfect, eternally unchanging being God.
We hold that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and eternal existence belong to God. For that is what God is.
Here we learn about Aristotle's answer to one of the most basic philosophical questions, the existence and nature of God. The philosopher can come to know God's nature, Aristotle says, simply by thinking about demonstrated principles and their implications.
This substance can have no magnitude, and hence has no parts and is indivisible. And this being must be unaffected by anything, and must be unalterable in every respect.
Aristotle concludes that God can have no physical characteristics, in line with his doctrine that motion is caused by a being that never changes. As we've seen, anything that has physical characteristics must be composed of matter, and anything made of matter is always subject to change. Since the unmoved mover can't be material and yet is alive, Aristotle reasons that it must be pure intellect. The function of the intellect is to think. But we must not assume that the unmoved mover is even aware of the universe whose motion it sustains. In fact,
God must think about either himself or something else. If he thinks about something other than himself, he must think about the same thing always, or different things. Does it make a difference whether he thinks about what is noble or what just happens to be true? It is absurd to say that this thought is concerned with some objects. It is clear that God thinks about what is most divine and most honorable, and does not change. A change, of course, would be for the worse, and would imply motion of some sort. Therefore, if this is to be avoided, the divine mind thinks of itself, if this is the best object of thought, and the thinking of the divine mind is thinking about thinking.
Unfortunately, Aristotle does nothing to explain this perplexing notion more clearly. We're left to wonder what it means to say God spends eternity in thought about thought. This much, however, is clear. Aristotle's God is not the intimate, personal God of the theologians. Aristotle's God doesn't consider the universe or the creatures that inhabit it. But this God's perfection is mirrored, however imperfectly, throughout the changing universe. Aristotle's thoughts about the nature of God would shape the course of Western theology for the next 2,000 years. St. Thomas of Aquinas especially emphasized Aristotle's insights into motion and causation. In his philosophical discussions of God more than 1,500 years after Aristotle lived, Aquinas would combine the great philosopher's insights with more traditional teachings of the Church in an effort to prove that God exists.